Welcome to Versus Trump, the podcast where we talk about how the Trump administration is breaking the law and what people are doing about it. I'm one of your hosts, Jason Harrow, and I'm talking one-on-one today with Isha Anand, live from San Francisco. Hey, Isha.
Hi, Jason. How's it going?
Doing great. So, listeners, today we're going to talk about the legal topic that's on many people's minds, and that is how to count people in this country in the next decennial census. Huge controversy broke out about this last week. Lawsuits have been filed. There are many plaintiffs, 2 specific lawsuits. We're going to cover the ground here, and I'll let you know what's going on and whether these claims might succeed, as we try to do every week with all these different lawsuits about the Trump administration. Isha, this is going to be fun. Did you think that we'd be talking about the census when we started this podcast around this time last year?
Around this time last year, I think I was still shell-shocked. And so it seemed plausible to me that we would talk about literally everything about democracy and American life, because it was so clear that the administration was going to seek to destroy every piece of it. So I don't know if I specifically thought the census, but I kind of figured this guy's in office, we're headed for really bad times. There will be no shred of the Constitution that it will be left untouched by the end of this.
That's right, including perhaps the enumeration clause, which I didn't learn about in law school. I don't think that anyone did, but we'll learn about it today. So, dear listeners, you can find us online at takecareblog.com/podcast. You can email us at versustrumppodcast@gmail.com. At versustrumppod is our Twitter handle that we don't use all that often, but we'll try to get on it. Thanks for all the listening and all the support over the last year. We started this in April of 2017, so this is our first episode in April of 2018. We've lasted the year, so has the Trump administration.
Happy birthday, Jason!
Yes, that's right. So it's been great, and keep spreading the word, keep talking about it. Our listenership continues to tick upwards slowly but surely, and we're on a new platform too, so we can measure everyone even more exactly, and it's nice to see. So thanks for all the kind words, Isha, but let's talk about how we count people in this country.
Let's do it.
Yeah. So quick background to the events of both the last couple of years and last week. And then, Isha, why don't you talk about the 2 lawsuits that have been filed, one by California and one by a multi-state and even multi-city coalition led by New York. So we've got the two coasts covered here with 2 different lawsuits. So the census, dear listeners, has been around since the founding. The framers had the quite good idea that in order to run a democracy, we have to know who is living in the democracy. And so there is a clause in the Constitution that requires what's called the decennial census. Every 10 years, the federal government goes around, knocks on people's doors, quite literally, and finds out who is living in the country. And the Constitution specifies that free persons need to be counted, not free citizens, not adults, not any other class of person, but free persons need to be counted every 10 years. And then that information is used in all sorts of ways. Isha, reading about this litigation and reading the complaints here, you realize it's not just in terms of doling out electoral votes and sending the data to the World Atlas so that we can know how many people live in California versus how many people live in Wyoming. It's much more. There's appropriations for dozens of federal programs that are based on population. There is complicated, mathematics regarding districting at all levels, at the House level, at the state level, and things like that. So this is really important stuff that the federal government does every 10 years. And indeed, it takes an ongoing effort to compile this data, catalog the data, ask additional questions about the population, and know who we are as a country in this democracy. So that's the background of the census. Since in the modern era, that is since 1950, we have not asked people whether they are a citizen or whether anyone in their household is a citizen on these census questions that are mailed to every address in the United States. And this has been looked at over the last several decades. And the reason that has been a consensus of bipartisan group of former census directors is that is likely to lower response rates. There is federal law saying that data from the census cannot be used for any purposes, like any criminal prosecution purposes. So if you are not a citizen and you say lie about that, or if you are not a citizen and are not properly here, you're undocumented, and you tell the government that, there's law that's saying they're not supposed to use that information to prosecute you or deport you or anything. That said, there's 314 some odd million people in this country, and it's quite understandable that not everyone would be assured that the government is not going to misuse that data. This is something that shows up in your mailbox. It's from the federal government. You're giving an answer back to the federal government. So the worry has been that a citizenship question will lower response rates. Over the last couple of decades, though, Republicans have started to want this question added for a pretty simple political reason. Lower response rates help the Republican Party. Now, why is that? And this actually, I didn't fully understand, Isha, until I started reading about this. Did you get this? Was this intuitive to you?
So one of the things I want to talk about in this episode is a case that came up to the Supreme Court while I was clerking there, where the question was, can you draw state legislative districts by sort of eligible voters rather than by total population? And that case, it was very clear which side the blue states were on and which side the red states were on.
Exactly. And here's the simple reason that I realized. It's that where there is a greater immigrant population, a greater non-citizen population, not counting those non-citizens will very simply reduce the political power of that group. So, for instance, just take an example. The number of seats in the House of Representatives in the United States is fixed. And therefore, every 10 years, based on population, those numbers are redistributed. They're not every seat added is taken away from somewhere. So it's all about the balance of power, not like the raw numbers. And of course, the House of Representatives, it's not just important to have more representatives, but through the Electoral College, that also gets translated into power to elect the president. So this is particularly important. So if we're counting all the people that live in a state with lots of immigrants, they're going to get more seats in the House and more electoral votes. If we're counting only citizens, then places where there are lots of legal permanent residents or other non-citizens living there are going to have their political power diminished relative to places where there's a very high citizen-only population. So if you do the math, you realize that places with lots of immigrants, like California, tend to be left-leaning, tend to be Democratic, and places with relatively fewer immigrants, like Iowa and places in the upper Midwest, tend to be Republican-leaning. So if we are only counting the citizens, or we're just in general undercounting people who are harder to count, non-citizens, transient folks, people living abroad, then you're going to get the population of the Iowas of the country are going to look larger relative to the population of the Californias of the country. And therefore, Iowa will have more political power, more representatives, more money than California. Again, because it's all relative. These things are a fixed pool and they're being split up based on what proportion of people that we think are overall living in the country are actually living in those places.
Right. And so what will be most interesting about these lawsuits is to see what the Texases and Arizonas of the world do, right? So they are Republican controlled and have historically not been super sympathetic to the concerns of non-citizens, right? I mean, in the 2010 census, Arizona's kind of draconian show me your papers law was sort of flagged as one of the causal reasons why the 2010 census actually had a lower response rate among Latino communities throughout the country. But presumably Arizona and Texas want all the representatives they can get, right? And so it's sort of in their interest to count all those non-citizens toward their total population number. So I think that will be the interesting test is what do Republican states with huge undocumented populations do?
Exactly.
And this is like it would not be crazy. It would not be the first time that Republicans have to some extent shot themselves in the foot over this. So back in 2010, Glenn Beck famously, I had forgotten about this, had a whole campaign that was like, big government coming to get all this information from you. We don't know how they're going to use it. Do you really want people spying on you? And had this whole like libertarian push, like don't respond to the census, which as sort of partisan commentator, that's like the last thing you want to do, right? You want people in your demographic to show up and fill this thing out as much as possible.
Yeah, exactly. So let's put a pin on that sort of ways of disenfranchisement or ways of counting and just get to what occurred over the last couple months and then culminating last week. So like we said, this citizenship question has not appeared on the actual census. It has appeared on something called the American Community Survey, which is sent out to a much smaller percentage of American households. It's much longer. It takes about 30 minutes to fill out. It has a relatively low response rate. I think it goes to about 6% of US households. And these kind of secondary questions can be used to extrapolate data, all kinds of data like that go beyond the 10 or fewer questions on the census itself. So citizenship has been asked about before, but it has never, or in recent memory, been asked on the census itself that is mailed to every household in the US. But that changed last week, and it was prompted by a letter that was revealed in December of 2017 in ProPublica by the Attorney General Sessions and the Trump Department of Justice, which sent a letter to the Census Bureau requesting this question. And their reasons were quite interesting for listeners of this podcast who will know that Jeff Sessions and the Trump DOJ have not been a champion of voting rights, to put it mildly. There's a whole archive of Versus Trump episodes and Take Care blog posts, including last week's interview with Rick Hasen, who is a voting rights expert, talking about all the ways that the Trump administration has sought to disenfranchise people. But the Trump Department of Justice wrote a letter to the Census Bureau saying, we have this requirement in Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to try and ensure that minorities can elect representatives of their choice or have a chance at doing so. And we need to know how many citizens are actually living in some of these majority-minority districts. And in order to get better data on citizenship, why don't we ask everyone in the country if every person in their household is a citizen? That's what the letter essentially says. I'm paraphrasing, of course. And the Census Bureau, which is required to send to Congress a list of the questions that will appear on the 2020 census by the end of March of 2018, it considered this advice. It went through a couple of different options with regard to citizenship. Should we agree with the Department of Justice? Should we keep the way it is, which is we only ask a small subset of U.S. households if they're citizens and not on the main form? And even though they agreed that there were concerns about response rates, the Census Bureau ultimately said that there's no definitive proof, no empirical evidence that response rates will be lower with this question. And therefore, because of the value to the Voting Rights Act and the vindication of voting rights for which Jeff Sessions, as you know, is known, Isha, the Trump administration would add this question in 2020. So, cue the lawsuits. Isha, you want to take up the story there? Cue the
lawsuits. Yeah. So we're still at the very early stages. We've just got complaints in. We've got one by California and one by a coalition of states and cities, including, interestingly, some cities in California, like the city of San Francisco. And they're basically raising two claims about this plan. So the first one is under the enumeration clause itself, Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3. And the second one is under the Administrative Procedures Act. And so we'll talk about each of them in turn, but underlying both of these claims is a sort of factual contention that seems to sort of be indisputably true. The sort of factual premise is this will lower response rates overall. And that's because, the census comes in the mail, like Jason said, it's sort of an official federal government piece of mail. And then that's, only about 2/3 of people answer it that way. And then there's 500,000 people who literally go door to door, pound on the door, go back a half dozen times to get you to talk to them and get this information. And to have either of those be accurate requires a fair amount of trust, right? You've got to, as Jason said, when you get the thing in the mail, you got to be able to think to yourself, okay, I can send in this information and I know that it's going to be protected in some way. Asterisk footnote, in researching this episode, I realized that despite the fact that the census has a number of really strong protections, it has a sort of checkered past on this front in terms of information privacy. Apparently, during Japanese internment, the Census Bureau gave out all kinds of information to kind of assist with the roundup, including kind of the precise number of Japanese Americans living within a census block. So you could make sure that you kind of got everyone. So anyway, that's all to say. So it requires a fair amount of trust either to fill out this form and send it back in, or to trust the stranger who appears on your doorstep, who may or may not speak the same language as you and tells you it's okay to tell me all this information about you. And in a climate of real fear, right? So there have been some field testing of the census And Dara Lind at Vox has a kind of definitive primer on this. And she pulls out some really dramatic examples. During one field test, a respondent actually fled her home when she started getting questions, and another family moved abruptly after an interview with a census employee, right? I mean, people got really scared, even in a field test that didn't include a citizenship question, just because there's been so much attention to kind of rounding up undocumented folks. And so the worry here, in short, is people are already scared of the census, right? Even when it didn't have a citizenship question, that, a lot of communities, particularly undocumented communities, didn't see the federal government as an ally. And the federal government already had difficulty because of language barriers, because of lack of trust, for other reasons, reaching out to certain communities. And this is only going to exacerbate that a millionfold, because as soon as you start asking about citizenship, it's much, much harder to say, no, but we really don't care whether you're undocumented or not. We're just like curious. We're curious whether you're a citizen. And so accepting that factual premise, which the complaints make a pretty good case for, based both on the experience of this field testing, based on kind of common sense, based on an amicus brief submitted by the last 4 directors of the Census Bureau in the Supreme Court case I mentioned, which we'll talk more about later. They sort of say, like, look, there's no reason to believe that this will improve the amount of information, the response rate. Every reason to believe it will diminish the response rate. And so that's both contrary to the constitutional mandate, which says, like, enumerate every person in America, enumerate them, and contrary to the Administrative Procedures Act, which we talked about before on the show, and is basically the thing that says every agency of the federal government, you can sue them if they do something that is, quote, arbitrary and capricious. And there's a couple of theories for why this is arbitrary and capricious, namely that the big ones are, 1, doesn't help you get better information, only a lower response rate. So, like, what's the, like, rational reason to do this? 2, we've got something called the Information Quality Act, which says that you're supposed to try to minimize the burden to respondent and maximize the amount of information collected. This doesn't seem to be in accordance with that, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole slew of reasons why this is arbitrary and capricious. So those are kind of the 2 big claims, again, both predicated on this idea that even though we don't have a kind of systematic set of empirical evidence, we've got common sense and experience telling us that this is going to dramatically lower response rates. And we should be clear, we'll lower response rates not just among non-citizens, right? But also among folks who share space with non-citizens, right? So if I am in what's called a mixed household, if I've got folks in my home who are undocumented or who are non-citizens, I don't want to let you in, even if I'm a citizen. Once you start asking about citizenship, I'm more likely to just turn you away at the door. And so you miss out on counting not only the non-citizens in the house, but also the citizens. This is a point California makes, that they're going to lose representation, not only because of the number of foreign-born and non-citizen individuals in the state, but also because of the number of U.S. citizens who share living space with someone who is not a U.S. citizen.
Yeah, that's right. I think, Isha, your explanation does a great job of showing sort of how these two are related, in the sense that the action by the Trump administration here is arbitrary and capricious precisely because it really doesn't do anything for the enumeration purpose, right? That if the job here is to count people, then the question should be making sure that counting people are accurate, right? Knowing who they are, what their age is, essentially who is living here, and not much more. Right. That's the overall purpose of the census. The purpose, like we said, there are these other mechanisms like the American Community Survey and all the other work that the Census Bureau does to figure out more data about people, right? It would be really wonderful if the Census Bureau could collect from every single household in the United States all sorts of questions. We could do incredible research if, for instance, people were asked if they've ever had cancer and what treatments they took. We could do incredible research about income if we knew what colleges or schools people attended and what their outcomes were. But obviously, we don't want people to feel like it's a chore to fill this out. We don't want people to lie about these things. We don't want any of these things. We want to first and foremost count people. And so anything that hinders the government's ability to count everyone cannot be consistent with the purposes of both, the the administrative regulations and the laws with respect to the census, which is what the Administrative Procedure Act is targeting, and just the Constitution itself, and making sure that people are properly enumerated. So, I mean, don't you think that these, sometimes we talk about like the APA is like purely procedural, like they did something, they just didn't notice and comment, or they did something wrong. And that's kind of a sideways attack to try and get at the merits. Here it feels like both of these kinds of claims are directly at the heart of what the government is doing wrong.
Yeah, I think that is precisely correct. The multi-state lawsuit raises some kind of procedural issues that contribute to the arbitrariness. They say, look, all these stakeholders wrote in and said, like, here are a million reasons to believe this is going to reduce the number of people who are going to respond to the census. And you didn't really like consider those or take those into account. And so that's sort of a procedural challenge. But you're right, the kind of heart of the challenge is you need to count everyone. You're not able to do that. And if I could just say one more word about the stakes here, which I know I've been droning on about, one piece of this that I didn't fully recognize until I kind of started digging into this is not the kind of thing where you can compensate by statistical techniques, right? So, a lot of times when we do surveys or we gather data, we can say like, okay, we recognize X population or Y population systemically underreports, and we can compensate for that in our kind of modeling scheme. But the Supreme Court has held in a case called Department of Commerce versus House of Representatives that for apportionment purposes, so asterisk, as Jason said, the census in the past has used what's called a long-form census questionnaire, which goes out to only 1/6 of households. In the past 20 years, they've done something called the American Community Survey, which is sort of 2.5% of households. They collect data not from every single person for reasons other than apportionment. But for apportionment purposes, that is, how many representatives does each state get, you cannot use statistical sampling. You literally have to count everyone. And that's an interpretation of the Census Act against the backdrop of the Enumeration Clause. You can do something what's called hot deck imputation. This is from a case called Utah versus Evans, which basically says that if what you do is you try to count every single person, you set out to count every single person. So unlike sampling where you say we're only going to, we know we're not going to get everyone, you try to count every single person, and there's someone you just are not able to get after you visit their house a half dozen times and knock on their door. You can do what's called imputation, where you say, we'll look at kind of the neighbors and impute something to you. So we'll say like you are demographically similar to the person who lives in that house or lives next door to you or whatever. And that's called hot deck imputation because it's based on the current census, right? So like if you can't find me in the 2020 census, you use my neighbor's demographics from the 2020 census, not like me in the 2010 census. That would be cold deck imputation. So hot deck imputation is allowed, but that only in some ways exacerbates the problem, right? Because if you've got whole Latino communities that are declining to respond, it may be the case that you would say, okay, well, like we can impute their sort of neighbors' value to that person, but it also could be the case that this just means that you're having to go further and further away because of residential segregation to when you do the kind of imputing. And so, this is a problem not just like literally counting everyone in the country is not just like the mandate of the Constitution. It's also Supreme Court precedent that you can't fill in the gaps in any of the kind of known statistical sampling ways. So when someone declines to answer, you can't fix it in post, right? That person is that information is just not there.
Yeah. Love the deep tracks on the census. Love the deep track. So, I have the impression, Isha, that, and I think you do too, that because of the weak reasoning, and we'll link to a post on balkanization talking about why the Voting Rights Act reason here is not only just disconnected from the census itself, but on its face makes no sense, right? As I mentioned before, the people administering Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act simply do not need more granular citizenship data. It's just not a need for them, for the purposes that they wish. And the stated positions of the Trump Department of Justice are completely inconsistent with their desire to increase enforcement of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, right? I mean,
so, and just for our listeners, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is the one that says you've got, where you can, you want to draw districts that give minority voters representation. So you want to draw what are called majority-minority districts. So you want to say, look, if there are a bunch of Black voters here, we want to draw a district that allows them to elect the representative of their choice. And so the argument is, well, the only way we can know whether this district we've drawn allows them to elect the representative of their choice is to look not at how many Black people are living in the district, but how many Black people who are able to vote are living in the district. And Citizenship is one way we can get that number sort of more accurate. But the whole Section 2 exercise is very probabilistic, right? Because Black people don't vote as a block. So just ensuring that a majority of the eligible voters are Black doesn't like actually answer the question. And so you don't need this kind of granular, precise data. You need this sort of rough, big picture sense of what the demographics look like and how many citizens there are, which the American Community Survey, that thing that's sent out to 2.5% of Americans, but contains much more detail, can get you. And it's a much bigger problem. These two things are used in tandem, right? And so it's a much bigger problem if you just don't know how many people there are because everyone's too scared to answer the census than it is if your estimates about citizenship are based on a survey sent to 2.5% of Americans, but which we can supplement with lots and lots of statistical modeling to get a pretty good sense of what the whole country looks like. So again, for apportionment purposes, you cannot use sampling, and therefore you need to be able to count every single person, and it matters when someone won't answer a question. And so that's what the census does, and that's why the citizenship question matters there. For the VRA Section 2, you can use all kinds of statistical methodologies, so it's less of a big deal if you don't have precise data, and so that's where the citizenship question belongs, in the space where you want more information, but it doesn't need to be as precise because you can use statistics to fill in the gaps, rather than in the situation where you don't need very much information at all. You need like a 1, 2, 3, but you cannot use any mechanism to fill in the gaps.
Boy, wouldn't it be awesome if like the Census Bureau had created like a secondary form for exactly these kinds of tasks, like things where we need somewhat less granular information, but still. Oh, wait, they did. Right. And we've been asking that question for decades on that form. And now the Trump administration supposedly wants to increase Voting Rights Act. Let me just say that again. The Trump administration wants to enforce the Voting Rights Act through this question about citizenship. So let's get to the claim that dare not speak its name, Isha, which you talked about a couple of weeks ago with respect to litigation around the border wall. We'll link to that episode, listeners. But Isha, you made the point that while it's really nice to have all these legal claims in here based on the based on the enumeration clause and based on the Administrative Procedure Act, and calling out the pretext, noting that the political environment is likely to make the response rates quite low for certain, especially Latino immigrants who are not citizens. What is you mentioned that there is a reason here that the Trump administration wishes to do it, and it goes often by the name of animus or discrimination, perhaps racism, depending on how you can, what your view is of that term and of Latinos as a quote unquote race, but some form of discrimination against an identifiable block of folks in this country who may or may not be citizens. That claim, though, is not in this case as a formal matter. There is no claim that the Equal Protection Clause has been violated here. What do you think of that? Do you think that's a mistake, or do you think the kind of intimations of animus, of discrimination, of racism are enough here?
So I'm curious to hear your take on this, because you were a government lawyer, and I suspect that there are constraints on government lawyers that the rest of us don't fully understand. I will say, so Jason's talking about when we did the border wall episode, I said, we accept that the Constitution polices motive. There are things you can do when you're doing them for a non-racist reason that you cannot do if you're doing it for a racist reason. And the classic example is the Muslim ban, where, it's perfectly plausible that an administration could have done a detailed study and said, we are banning people from these 7 countries. But when you know that Donald Trump did it because he hates Muslims, it's not constitutionally acceptable. And same thing with the border wall. Perfectly plausible. An administration could decide a border wall is what we need. Not okay if the reason you do it is because you think Mexicans are rapists, as our president has tweeted. And so here the argument would be perfectly plausible to put a citizenship question on the census. Someone could think that was a good idea for whatever reason, but where it's motivated by animus and racism, not such a good idea. So I have to say this bothers me a little bit less than in the border wall case for 2 reasons. The first, and that's those sort of 2 sides of the equation I outlined. So I said, perfectly plausible to do it for a legitimate reason. Here, obviously, they did it for an illegitimate reason. So first, I think it's actually not perfectly plausible they would do it for a legitimate reason, right? So unlike the border wall, where you have prior administrations sort of deciding that they actually want a border wall for various reasons, here, it's been, as Jason said, since 1950 was the last time we tried to ask everyone in America about the citizenship status. Now, since then, Donald Trump has spread a bunch of misinformation about this that I want to clarify, which is that Donald Trump says we have done it every year except for 2010. That's not true. Every year we've done something called the long form census, which only went to 1 in 6 Americans that asked a citizenship question. But so here, I don't think it's perfectly plausible you could want to do this for a legitimate reason. And then on the other side of the equation, it's harder to disentangle. Like the border wall was sheer animus. It was literally Mexicans are rapists. We don't want them. Here, there's surely some animus. We've got a bunch of tweets about non-citizens voting and so on. But there's also some kind of like political calculation, which is harder to tease out, right? Like if they are doing this so that Republican states get more representatives, that's bad. And potentially, depending on how the Supreme Court rules on the partisan gerrymandering case that we've talked about in previous episodes, potentially unconstitutional, but not nearly as clear-cut as if they're doing it because they hate Latinos. And it's hard to kind of tease those two things apart in this case. Is it for political power reasons or is it because they hate Latinos? The first one, unclear as yet whether that's unconstitutional. Second one, definitely unconstitutional. Does that make sense?
It does make a lot of sense. And we've talked before and about this vexing relationship between the fact that minorities tend to vote more for Democrats. And so political maneuvers that tend to disenfranchise them have a racial component and a discrimination component, but also a political raw power move component. And the courts have been quite bad at kind of linking those up, right? They've often let folks get away with these things that have a sheen of non-racial component, even open partisanship, right? That's what the partisan gerrymandering cases are about. These cases are exactly a reaction to racial gerrymandering by saying, no, we weren't taking race into account. We were just purely trying to screw Democrats. And it just so happens that Democrats are, or that African Americans and Latinos are overwhelmingly Democrat. And so we're just trying to screw them, but it's not because they're black, it's because they're Democrats. And, the last year and a half, to me, have really both proved that lie, right? They are as related as they have ever been in U.S. history. And you can't separate the political power from racial bloc voting because they're related, right? I mean, when one party wants to disenfranchise people because they're of a party and that party happens to be many folks of a minority group, then things just naturally get racially charged. There kind of is no difference. So I'd like to see that claim in the case because I'd like to see the courts push forward this link between political power and race, national origin, citizenship status. And this is really the perfect vehicle, Isha. So I see that you're nodding as well. And the reason I like it as a vehicle is because it goes slightly over the line of not just partisanship, right? The question is about citizenship. So it exists in between obvious race-based questioning, right? And pure partisanship, where in the partisan gerrymandering case and things, this is, everyone knows, and it can't be disputed, that, the folks that are more likely to not be citizens are recent immigrants. And recent immigrants in states like California are often Latino, sometimes Muslim, right? Groups that the president doesn't like and has stated his animus against. So it gives the court this really nice, to me, it's almost like the missing link here. In the fossil record, where it's a link exactly between racial groups and partisanship that is just perfect. And I mean, it will certainly come out here because to prove this claim up, California and New York and the states will undoubtedly talk about why the stated reasons are a pretext. And in order to prove why they're a pretext, they will have to show why all these populations are less likely to respond than other populations, including, white citizens in Iowa and things like that. Not picking on Iowa, of course. They're good people and they have refugees and all that stuff. But, they are whiter than California for sure. And so it will come out, but I do wish it were in the case explicitly. And in answer to the first part that you asked, Isha, do I know why this is happening since I was a government lawyer? I was a lowly, what they call line attorney, right? I wasn't in the decision-making meetings high up where in these very high-profile lawsuits that are going to get tons of press release and coverage by the Attorney General on CNN and stuff. I wasn't in those meetings where they decided to make the claims. I just litigated the claims we had. They're nice complaints, Both of them read really well. They have nice history. They're to the point. But I do wish that that they made that claim, because this is just that perfect missing link type case for me.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wonder whether it is a state that depends on the federal government for funding, maybe has a marginally harder time accusing the federal government of racism, although they've had to do it in so many lawsuits at this point. What's one more, right? There have been so many lawsuits where there have been explicit animus claims that, it sort of seems like...
California and the Trump administration aren't exactly seeing eye to eye these days, given the amount of litigation. We haven't even gotten to some of the other important California litigation.
I know, there's so much happening.
It's been bumped by the new stuff. So I guess I have one other thought on the case. So just to give folks an update, like Isha said at the top here, these cases were just filed, one in the Northern District of California before a judge named Judge Seaborg, who is an Obama appointee. The Southern District of New York case, the multi-state case, has been filed in federal court in Manhattan. It's so new as we talk about this, Isha, that it doesn't even have a judge assigned yet. No real action has been taken in either case, so we'll watch it and see where they go. But I just have one other thought. That's kind of another deep cut. So you gave us the details of census taking and how the difference between extrapolation and sampling and hot and cold, which I absolutely love. One piece of information that caught my eye in these filings, that I don't know if it caught your eye, was the weird use that these memos made of the fact that this particular question gets horribly unreliable responses. Right? I don't know if you noticed this, but the citizenship question, according to the Trump administration's own memos, is inaccurate approximately 30% of the time.
That's bananas.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. For understandable reasons.
Right.
If it doesn't matter, right, and you're a non-citizen, even if you're a legal permanent resident, why would you want to, you're not sure of your green card status. You don't know what it's going to be used for. We have It was within people's lifetimes when Japanese Americans were interned in the United States, right, using census data. Why, if you were a non-citizen, would you ever want to answer, yeah, sure, I'm a non-citizen, right? I mean, it doesn't make sense. And so understandably, somewhere around 30% of respondents get this wrong in the current way that it's asked. And yet the Trump administration wants to continue to feature this question for Voting Rights Act purposes, and what? They're gonna get better data? I mean, it's weird that this wasn't highlighted more, but it reminds me, Isha, when I read it, of one of my favorite lines from Arrested Development, where Tobias, the closeted gay character, is talking to his wife Lindsay, and he's a therapist, and Tobias says that, maybe it's time for an open relationship, and Tobias has advised a number of couples to explore open relationships, and Lindsay, his wife, says, well, did it work? And Tobias says, well, no, in my experiences, it never does. I mean, these people are delusional. And then he kind of pauses and goes, but it might work for us, right? I mean, that's exactly the Trump administration's attitude, which is, this question doesn't work, but maybe this time it will work. And they have no evidence of it, right? It just doesn't make sense to me.
So can I put forward one potential additional motivation, partisan motivation?
Yes.
So I mentioned at the top of the hour that when I was clerking at the court, there was a really interesting case that came before us called Evanwell versus Abbott. And this is a case where a Republican interest group challenges Texas's districting scheme. So how, Texas's state legislature apportions districts, and says, this violates the Equal Protection Clause because each district contains the same number of people, but not the same number of voters. And so I, who live in a district where every single person can vote, my vote, there's 100 people in my district, all of them can vote. And so my vote is 1/100th of a representative. And next door, there's still 100 people, but only 50 of them can vote. The other 50 are non-citizens or young people or, folks who have felony convictions and so have been disenfranchised. And so the guy next door, his vote counts twice as much as mine because he's competing with only 49 other people to elect a representative. I'm competing with 100 other people. So this gets to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, no dice. At the very least, the Constitution allows you to draw districts on the basis of total population rather than number of voters. And so again, we should distinguish between apportionment among the states, which is definitely has to be done by total population per the 14th Amendment, Section 2, and apportionment within a state. So for House of Representatives or for your internal state legislative purposes, which the Constitution doesn't put an express constraint on, but the Supreme Court has said has to adhere to the principle of one person, one vote. You can't just have one district with a bajillion people and one district with like the one rich guy in or whatever. So the Supreme Court says, no dice. The Constitution at least allows you to decide based on total number of people, not just number of voters. We needn't decide whether the total number of voters system would be allowed. And the case goes away. It's sort of a blockbuster case that turns into a nothing burger because the Supreme Court doesn't really announce anything. But that case kind of revealed to me what a kind of hobby horse this is on the right, the ability to draw districts based on number of voters, not number of citizens. And one of the kind of key moves in the United States' briefing, the United States came in on the side of saying that the Republican groups are wrong and the Constitution doesn't require drawing districts based on just voters. One of the key moves is the United States keeps saying, how would you even do this? You don't have this kind of citizenship data on a census level. And so for apportionment purposes, this makes no sense. Like you can't draw your districts accurately because you don't have, you don't have this data on the kind of granular level you do about total number of people. And so I wonder whether, even though it's going to be wildly inaccurate, even though it's going to dissuade people from responding to the census altogether, reducing our count of people, creating inaccuracies overall, I wonder whether it will arm groups on the right with the ammunition they need to convince their states to do their internal districting. And again, this doesn't mean Iowa gets more, Iowa's number of representatives still gets apportioned by the total number of people, although now total number of people will be a less accurate figure, but this is sort of Iowa's House of Representatives or Iowa's state legislature or how Iowa divvies up where its representatives are elected. Now, all of a sudden, one of the objections to this system is off the table, which is the census doesn't tell you who the eligible voters are. And they can say, well, give us more.
That's really insightful. I hadn't even thought of that. And that's right. This is part of a movement, and we'll see if these states can resist that movement. So that's it for the census. We'll keep going. There's been no motions for injunction or expedited briefing or anything so far, but again, these lawsuits are very new. I wouldn't be surprised if there are, because we've got to get this question settled in time for all the ballots to be, all the forms to be printed and to be mailed out and everything to be signed, sealed, and delivered, as it were. So hopefully these will be resolved one way or the other definitively. I think the timeline that I seem to have read was about a year, that the census needs about a year lead time. So that's the time frame to look out for these things. So not ultra expedited, listeners, but they should move along somewhat quickly. And we should get an answer to what you will be asked in 2020 when you see this form show up in your mailbox. Okay. Yes, quick Trump nugget before we go, since it's been a couple weeks since we've done Trump nuggets. I wanted to give updates on a couple of cases we've talked about before. We mentioned before on this show that there was an Emoluments Clause case going on in New York. That case was dismissed on standing grounds in an opinion that was criticized widely for not even remotely describing the law correctly, including citing some dissents as the actual law. But nonetheless, the case was kicked out. Just a few days ago in Maryland, there was another very similar case brought by the state of Maryland in D.C. District Court. And the judge there, perhaps unexpectedly, but broke with his fellow judge on the on the Southern District of New York, and is going to allow that case to proceed. So for all those listeners who wanted to get to the bottom of the Foreign Emoluments Clause issue and whether the Trump Organization and Trump International Hotel is accepting gifts from foreign countries in violation of the Emoluments Clause, that lawsuit, at least in the District of Columbia, continues for another day. On the other hand, we mentioned a victory by folks who wanted to stop the contraception mandate. That was a victory in a case in California. We discussed the Trump administration's changes that allow much broader religious exemptions for folks that have conscientious objections to providing birth control for women. And that is on hold now because of the actions of a district judge in California. But there are additional suits in that case. And a suit in Massachusetts was actually just kicked out of court. And so the court there disagreed with the court in California. I think the interesting point to make, aside from just updating those cases, so we've now, in two very high profile important cases, gotten two district court decisions going two different directions. The important thing to note is that it's useful to have multiple cases going with different kinds of plaintiffs, different kinds of standing arguments, different kinds of evidence, different kinds of lawyering, because as these cases show, it kind of only takes one. So the fact that the case was kicked in New York is unfortunate, but we've got a case going in Washington, and that could give complete relief eventually to the plaintiffs and really get to the bottom of the emoluments clause issue. Likewise, the fact that the contraception mandate case was kicked out in the District of Massachusetts doesn't affect the fact that it actually is continuing in California with some success. And of course, if there is a nationwide ruling ultimately by the Supreme Court as a result of that case, then that could happen. So that's just a quick update. It's kind of a circuit split roundup or district court split roundup. But that's what I got. Any thoughts on that, or you want to just say goodbye to the listeners, Isha?
No, that was super helpful, and I am looking forward. We should do more regular updating. Our Trump nugs should be updates.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in the beginning it was hard to because we would talk a lot about cases that were just filed, and then we'd have to wait. But now, a year into the show, we're starting to get meaningful decisions, and like I said, even conflicting decisions across the country. So we will have to track.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. And listeners, if there are particular cases that you want an update on, please just send us an email or tweet at us. We also, as we were researching this episode, we had the opportunity to actually read the 14th Amendment, Section 2, much more closely than we usually have. And there's this puzzling phrase that we didn't know quite what to make of, and we were curious to see if there are any history buffs among our listeners who could fill us in. So Section 2 of the 14th Amendment says, representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state. So like we said, total population, excluding Indians not taxed. What is that all about? So listeners, Google didn't tell us, and a quick search. If you have any clues, please write it.
And with that, we say, till next week.
Bye, Jason.
Thanks, Isha. Bye now.
The red light of the train shines back on me.